Missouri River Bluffs, October 1876. The air, sharp with the coming cold, carried the scent of wood smoke and curing leaves. On a patch of land overlooking a gray bend in the river, a man was doing something no one had ever seen before. Caleb Stroud was building his house out of a dead boat. Not just any boat, but the broken back of a 60-foot keelboat, salvage from a sandbar downriver. He and his ox had dragged it ashore, and for a week the valley echoed with the grating of his saws and the rhythmic thud of his mallet on splitting wedges. Now the two halves of the hull lay on the cleared ground like the ribs of a fallen beast. He was raising them, curved side out, to form the long walls of his cabin. Luther Pike, owner of the only sawmill for 50 miles, stood with his arms crossed, a permanent frown etched into his face. He'd made his fortune selling straight, true lumber to settlers who knew how to build a proper house. What Stroud was doing was an insult to the craft. "That's foolishness, Stroud," Pike called out, his voice carrying easily in the crisp air. "You're building a sieve. That's scrap wood, half-rotted and curved. It's got no strength. It'll leak wind like a wicker basket." Jedediah Morse and Elias Thorne, two farmers who had stopped their wagon to watch the spectacle, nodded in agreement. "He's right, Caleb," Morse said, shifting his weight. "A wall's got to be flat, got to be tight. That thing, it's unnatural." Caleb Stroud didn't stop his work. He braced a section of the curved hull, his movements economical and sure. He looked up at the men, his face calm. "A hull's meant to take pressure," he said, and then he turned back to his task, leaving the men to shake their heads. The word spread through the settlement before dusk. The new man, the boatwright from the Ohio, was either touched by some peculiar genius, or more likely, he was just plain crazy. What did this quiet Ohio River boatwright understand about the physics of heat and wind that a sawmill owner, a man who had built a dozen frontier homes, had missed? What secret was held in the curve of a hull and the tar between its seams that could defy a Missouri winter? The answer would not be found in argument, but in the brutal, clarifying test of the season to come. The story of how one man's strange idea redefined survival on this harsh frontier is a lesson in ingenuity. It's a story I'm going to share with you in detail. If you stick with me, I promise you will learn the fundamental principles of thermal conduction and how a simple, sealed gap of air can be more powerful than a foot of solid oak. To support more stories like this one, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and click the like button. And let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional building material you've ever seen used for a home? Caleb Stroud was not a carpenter, not in the way the men on the Missouri Bluffs understood the term. He had never framed a barn, never raised a post and beam house with its intricate mortise and tenon joints. He was not a farmer who saw wood as something to be cleared, burned, or split for fences. To Caleb, wood was a living, moving thing. It was a skin that separated a man from the crushing, indifferent pressure of water. He had grown up on the banks of the Ohio River, apprenticed at the age of 12 to a master boatwright who built the flatboats and keelboats that were the lifeblood of the nation's interior. His hands, calloused and knowing, had learned the language of steam boxes, adzes, and augers. He knew the precise curve a white oak plank could hold without fracturing. He understood the subtle art of caulking a seam with oakum and hot pitch, not just to keep water out, but to create a single, monolithic structure that could flex and move with the river's current. His world had been one of compound curves, of hydrodynamic efficiency, of creating a vessel that could slip through a hostile element with the least resistance. He thought in terms of hulls, ribs, and sealed integrity, not studs, joists, and siding. He and his wife Martha had come west with their two children, 10-year-old Samuel and 7-year-old Eliza, seeking land of their own. They arrived late the previous autumn, with just enough time to erect a hasty, conventional cabin before the first snows. It was a box of green, milled planks, bought on credit from Luther Pike's mill. It looked like every other cabin in the settlement, and it was a trap. That first winter had been a lesson in failure. The green wood shrank as it dried in the stove's heat, opening up 100 tiny cracks. The wind, a constant whining force that swept across the open bluffs, found everyone. It was a physical presence in their home, a malevolent guest that could not be evicted. Martha would hang blankets over the walls, but the cold crept through them. Caleb would feed the stove until it glowed cherry red, burning through their woodpile at an alarming rate, but the heat seemed to vanish into the walls themselves. He would stand near the wall and feel the warmth being wicked from his body, as if the planks were drinking it. At night they would huddle together under every blanket they owned, and in the morning, a delicate, cruel filigree of frost would have crept across the top quilt. Their daughter, Eliza, developed a cough that lingered for 2 months. The sound of the wind whistling through the boards became the soundtrack to their misery. Caleb knew he had failed his family, but he also knew the failure wasn't his alone. It was a failure of design. The problem wasn't the cold. The problem was the box they were trying to fight it with. The conventional cabins dotting the Missouri frontier were all built on the same principle: thick, solid walls. A man like Luther Pike would tell you with absolute certainty that a 6-inch thick oak wall was a strong barrier against the winter. He could sell you 12-inch planks, planed smooth, for a premium. To the settlers, mass equaled strength, and strength equaled warmth. It was an intuitive, deeply held belief, passed down from generations of European building traditions, and it was fundamentally wrong. Their neighbors, the Morse family, lived in a cabin with walls of squared logs, the gaps chinked with mud and moss. It was a fortress of solid material, yet Jedediah Morse spent his days in a perpetual cycle of chopping wood and feeding his fireplace. His wife sealed the windows with oiled paper, but the cold still radiated from the logs themselves. If you placed your hand on the interior wall, it felt like a block of ice. The wood was a highway for heat, a direct bridge from the warmth of the fire to the frozen air outside. This was the brutal reality of conduction. Heat, at its most basic level, is the vibration of molecules. In a solid material like a log or a plank, these molecules are packed tightly together. When one side of the wall is heated by a stove, its molecules begin to vibrate faster. They bump into their neighbors, which in turn start vibrating and bump into their neighbors, and so on, in a microscopic chain reaction. The energy of the fire was literally being passed hand to hand through the solid wall and given away to the winter. A thick wall only slowed the process. It didn't stop it. The settlers were trying to build a dam against the cold with a material that acted like a sponge. Furthermore, the flat, angular construction of their cabins presented a blunt obstacle to the wind. The relentless Missouri gales slammed into the walls head-on, the pressure forcing cold air through every minuscule crack left by shrinking wood or imperfect chinking. The wind didn't just go around the cabins, it tried to go through them. The constant battle against drafts was a battle against the very shape of their homes. Caleb Stroud, watching the river ice groan and the snow whip sideways, knew that fighting the wind head-on was a fool's errand. You didn't fight a current. You shaped your vessel to move with it, to shed its force. He had spent his life building things that did exactly that. The construction of Caleb's strange new home became a source of daily commentary for the settlement. He began by laying a foundation of flat river stones, building it up 2 feet from the ground. Then, with the help of his long-suffering ox, he wrestled the first half of the keelboat hull into place. It was a monstrously heavy 30-foot section of curved oak, its outer surface weathered gray, but its core still sound. He braced it and then began the even harder work of setting the second-half hull parallel to the first, leaving a 10-inch gap between them. Luther Pike made a special trip up the bluff just to mock him. "What in God's name is that, Stroud? You building a trough? A cradle? That gap is a waste. You'll have mice and snakes living in there before you even get a roof on." Pike's economic interest was clear. Every piece of scrap Stroud used was a plank he wasn't selling. "I've got a stack of fresh milled white pine down at the mill, tongue and groove. We could have you in a proper house in 2 weeks." Caleb wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a tar-stained hand. He looked at the gap, then at Pike. "The gap is the point," he said, his voice quiet. "The point? The point is you're building with air." Pike laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Air doesn't stop a thing. It doesn't stop a fist, and it sure as hell won't stop a January blizzard." Caleb offered no further explanation. He just went back to work. Over the next week, he framed in the front and back walls with conventional planking, cutting doors, and window openings. But the long, load-bearing walls were the curved hulls. He used skills honed on the riverbank, not the farmstead. He didn't nail the hull planks together. He drilled and pegged them to an interior frame, ensuring they held their shape. His most crucial work was invisible to the onlookers. Inside the 10-inch void between the inner and outer hulls, he meticulously sealed every joint and seam. He packed the gaps with oakum, a tarred fiber used for waterproofing boats, and then poured hot pitch over them, creating a completely airtight seal. From the outside it looked rough, but to Caleb, it was perfect. It was a captured column of air, 10 inches thick, 30 feet long, and 8 feet high. It was a vacuum of stillness. Martha watched him with a mixture of trust and bewilderment. She helped him mix the pitch and hand him his tools, her face smudged with soot. "It looks like we're living in a barrel, Caleb," she said one evening, as the curved walls loomed in the twilight. "The other women ask me what you're building. I don't know what to tell them." "Tell them it will be warm," Caleb replied, running his hand along a freshly tarred seam. "Tell them they won't feel the wind." He believed it with the certainty of a craftsman who trusted his materials and his design. The roof went on last, a standard planked and pitched affair, but it rested on the strange bowed walls of a boat that would never again see the water. By the time the first flakes of snow began to fall in late November, the Stroud family had moved into their Keelboat house, the smoke from their new stovepipe curling into a steel-gray sky. The mockery from the settlement subsided into a watchful, waiting skepticism. The real judgment was yet to come. The secret of Caleb's house was not the wood. It was the nothingness between the wood. Luther Pike was right when he said Caleb was building with air, but he was profoundly wrong about what that meant. The physics at play was a principle that frontier builders, with their focus on mass and solidity, had completely overlooked: the insulating power of trapped dead air. Heat transfers in 3 ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. The settlers' primary enemy was conduction. As explained, conduction is the transfer of heat through direct molecular contact. A solid oak log is a dense bridge of molecules, an excellent conductor. A standard cabin wall, at an R value of perhaps 1 per inch, offered minimal resistance. A 6-inch log wall had an R value of about 6. This meant for every degree of temperature difference between inside and outside, a certain amount of heat energy, measured in British thermal units or BTUs, would pass through each square foot of wall every hour. On a 0-degree day, with the inside at 65 degrees, a typical cabin was hemorrhaging thousands of BTUs through its walls alone. Caleb's design created a radical break in that conductive bridge. His outer hull took the full brunt of the outside cold. Its molecules vibrated slowly in the frigid air, But for that cold to reach the inner wall, it had to cross the 10-inch gap of air he had so carefully sealed. Air is a gas. Its molecules are spread far apart. For heat, or cold, to conduct across it, one molecule has to travel a relatively long way to bump into another. This makes still air a terrible conductor. It is, in fact, one of the most effective insulators on the planet. A 1-inch gap of still air has an R value of nearly 1. Caleb had created a 10-inch gap, but the key word is still. If the air in the gap can move, a different process takes over: convection. Warm air from the inner wall would rise, travel across the top of the gap, cool against the outer wall, and sink, creating a continuous loop that would efficiently shuttle heat from inside to out. This is why a simple, unsealed gap between walls offers little benefit. It's why Caleb's boatwright skills were so critical. By meticulously sealing every seam with oakum and pitch, he had stopped convection before it could start. He had created a 250 cubic foot pocket of truly dead air. That air was a thermal shield. The BTUs trying to escape his cabin reached the inner hull, but there the journey effectively stopped. The conductive path was broken. The energy had nowhere to go. Furthermore, the curved shape of the hulls, which the settlers saw as a weakness, was a brilliant solution to the wind. A flat wall confronts the wind, creating a high-pressure zone that forces air into every crack. A curved wall, like an upside-down ship's hull or an airplane wing, allows the wind to flow smoothly over its surface. It creates laminar flow, reducing the pressure on the walls and minimizing the infiltration of cold air. Caleb hadn't just built a warm box, he had built an aerodynamic one. He had used the logic of the river to solve a problem of the air. The winter of 1876 arrived not with a gentle dusting of snow, but with a roar. In the second week of December, a low-pressure system descended from Canada, pulling frigid Arctic air down the Missouri River Valley. The temperature plummeted from a mild 30 degrees to 5 below zero in less than a day. Then, the wind came. A savage, unrelenting gale from the northwest, picking up the loose snow from the plains and turning the world into a churning vortex of white. The settlers called it a river blizzard. It was forecast to last for at least a day. It would last for 30 hours. Inside the conventional cabins, the battle began. At the Morse homestead, Jedediah and his sons stuffed rags into the gaps that had opened in their chinking. The wind moaned through the squared logs, a low, mournful sound. The heat from their massive stone fireplace seemed to reach no more than 6 feet into the room. Beyond that circle of orange light, the air was bitter. Jedediah's wife reheated coffee every hour, the pot never leaving the stove. They were surviving, but it was a siege. At Luther Pike's house, a larger, 2-story structure made from his finest milled planks, the situation was little better. Though his walls were tighter, they were still single-layer boards. They were cold to the touch, radiating a deep, penetrating chill. Pike's wife had moved their children's beds away from the exterior walls and into the center of the room. Every time the wind gusted, the entire house groaned, and a fine powder of snow puffed from the windowsills. Pike, a man of pride and substance, was wearing his thickest wool coat inside his own home. His breath fogging in the air as he stood near the north-facing wall, he cursed the wind, cursed the cold, and fed cord after cord of his best-seasoned oak into his stove. The woodpile he had thought would last until February was shrinking at a terrifying rate. And at the Stroud cabin, there was quiet. The wind was a distant, abstract sound, a high-pitched shriek that seemed to pass over them, not through them. There were no drafts, none. The air inside was still and warm. Caleb had a small, efficient stove, and he fed it moderately with seasoned cottonwood, a fuel other settlers considered inferior. but the heat it produced stayed in the room. It filled the space, reflecting off the gently curved inner walls. Martha was at her spinning wheel, its quiet whirring a peaceful counterpoint to the storm outside. The smell of baking bread filled the small cabin, a scent of impossible normalcy. Samuel and Eliza were on a rug in the middle of the floor, playing a game with carved wooden animals. They were in their shirt sleeves. The frost that had haunted their blankets the winter before was gone. The cold was not their guest. It was a distant rumor, a story happening to other people. Caleb sat at his small table, mending a piece of harness, his movements relaxed. He had not built a fortress to fight the storm. He had built a pocket of calm, and his family was living inside it. The blizzard raged through the night and into the next day. The wind shifted, coming directly across the river, bringing with it a heavier, wetter snow that stuck to every surface. At the sawmill, the storm's fury was tearing at Luther Pike's livelihood. The immense stack of milled lumber, his inventory for the spring building season, was covered by a tarp, but the wind was a malevolent thief, plucking at its edges. Around noon on the second day, a massive gust ripped a corner of the heavy canvas loose. It flapped and snapped like a cannon shot, threatening to tear the entire covering away and expose thousands of dollars of prime lumber to the elements. Pike and his eldest son bundled themselves against the storm and went out to secure it. The world outside was a maelstrom. The wind drove the snow horizontally, stinging any exposed skin like 1,000 needles. They could barely see 10 feet in front of them. As they wrestled with the frozen canvas, a heavy 20-foot-long beam, dislodged from the top of the pile, slid free and tumbled into the blizzard-swept yard, rolling down the gentle slope toward the river bluff. "Damn it!" Pike roared, his voice snatched away by the wind. That single beam was worth a week's wages. He plunged into the white chaos after it, stumbling through knee-deep drifts. The beam came to rest against the one object standing in its path, the curved, tar-blackened wall of Caleb Stroud's Keelboat house. Pike, gasping for breath, his face caked in ice, finally reached it. He braced himself against the wall to catch his breath, expecting the familiar, bone-deep cold of a wind-battered plank, the vibration of a structure under siege. He felt nothing. No cold, no vibration, no draft. His gloved hand, pressed flat against the hull, registered only a dead, neutral surface, utterly disconnected from the screaming gale just inches away. He pushed his shoulder against it, leaning his full weight into the structure, seeking shelter. The wind howled over the curve of the roof, but the wall itself was silent. It was as still and placid as a stone in a deep pond. Pike was a man of practical things, a man who believed in the evidence of his senses, and his senses were telling him something impossible. Confused, he shuffled along the wall toward the front of the cabin. He peered through the small window, his eyes adjusting to the dim light within. He saw the Stroud family. He saw the children playing on the floor. He saw Martha pull a loaf of bread from a small oven. And then he saw the candle. It sat on a small table not 2 feet from the window, its flame a perfect, unwavering teardrop of light. Outside, the world was a horizontal fury, with snow streaming past the glass like a river. Inside, that tiny, fragile flame did not so much as flicker. It burned with a serene, impossible stillness. The gap between what he knew and what he saw shattered his certainty. The candle flame was the proof, a silent, eloquent testament to a principle he had mocked. He stood there for a long moment, the blizzard forgotten, the loose timber unimportant. Then he raised a heavy, snow-covered mitten and knocked on Caleb Stroud's door. When Caleb opened it, a gust of wind swirled into the room, making the candle flame dance for the first time. The blast of warmth that hit Pike's face was like stepping into another world. He stood there, a figure of ice and snow staring at the boatwright. He didn't apologize. He didn't offer praise. His mind was still reeling, trying to reconcile the two realities. He looked past Caleb at the placid flame, then back at the man himself. "How?" Pike asked, his voice raspy. "Just how?" Caleb Stroud did not gloat. He simply stepped back and held the door open. "Come in out of the cold, Luther. I'll show you." That afternoon, as the blizzard finally began to wane, the loudest critic on the Missouri River bluffs became the first student of the boatwright's art. Caleb explained it simply, using a piece of charcoal on a spare plank. He drew the two curved walls, the sealed gap. He talked about the stillness of the air, how it refused to carry the cold across the void. Others came later, drawn by the story Pike began to tell, a story of a silent wall and a steady flame. Jedediah Morse, Elias Thorne, men who had shaken their heads in derision, now stood in the warm, quiet cabin, touching the inner wall and feeling the absence of cold. Caleb answered their questions without pride, as a craftsman sharing his trade. When Pike asked him why he hadn't explained it sooner, Caleb gave a simple, honest answer. "You would not have believed words," he said. "You had to feel the quiet." The mockery lasted a few months. The validation would last a generation. By the following spring, the boat wall cabin was no longer a curiosity but a model. The first to copy the design were, fittingly, other men of the river. Two carpenters who ran the ferry across the Missouri built a new ferry hut for passengers waiting in the winter. They used the salvaged hull of a wrecked barge, splitting it and creating the same double-walled, air-gapped structure. The hut, once a miserable, drafty shed, became a haven of warmth on the wind-whipped riverbank. Travelers spoke of it, marveling at how a small stove could keep the space so comfortable. Luther Pike, in a move that stunned the settlement, became the design's greatest advocate. He didn't have any more derelict boats, but he understood the principle. He began milling custom-curved planks at his sawmill, designing a system where settlers could build the double walls from new lumber, creating the crucial air gap. It cost more than a standard cabin, but as Pike explained to his customers, the savings in firewood would pay for the difference in 2 winters. By the end of 1878, 6 new homes in the region were built using the Stroud method. The design was particularly popular for structures in exposed locations, trading posts on the open prairie, line shacks for ranchers, and stations for the telegraph operators. The principle was sound, and the frontier, which valued results above all else, adopted what worked. Caleb Stroud never sought recognition and never made an extra dollar from his innovation. He had built it for his family, to keep them safe and warm. That was his only goal. But his idea, born from the unique knowledge of his old trade, had fundamentally changed the equation of survival for those who came after him. The quiet boatwright from Ohio had, in his own way, anticipated principles of building science that would not become standard for nearly a century. The concept of the thermal break, the interruption of a conductive path, is now a cornerstone of modern construction. High-efficiency windows use the same principle as Caleb's wall, 2 panes of glass separated by a sealed gap of inert gas. Modern wall systems, with their layers of sheathing, insulation-filled cavities, and vapor barriers, are direct descendants of that first crude keelboat house. What Caleb Stroud built out of scrap and necessity, we now manufacture with advanced materials and engineering. He had discovered, through craft and intuition, a fundamental truth about how to live comfortably in a hostile climate. There is a simple, profound elegance in Caleb Stroud's solution. He lived in a world of movement, of currents and pressures. He knew that the shape that moves most easily through a storm can also be the shape that best withstands it. A boat hull is designed to part the water, to shed the immense forces of the river without breaking. Caleb simply took that logic and applied it to the air, another fluid that flowed and pushed against the lives of the settlers. He didn't build a dam to block the river of wind. He built a hull to let it slide past. His house was not a fortress standing in opposition to the wilderness. It was a vessel, intelligently designed, anchored in a sea of grass, keeping its occupants safe and calm while the tempest raged outside. We hope you found this story both informative and inspiring. The history of the frontier is filled with these small, often forgotten acts of genius. If you'd like to continue learning with us, please subscribe to the channel and don't forget to ring the bell to be notified of our new videos. Thank you for watching. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any modern application of these or similar techniques should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.